By now, you should have a pretty good understanding of liberalism. We've looked at how economic liberalism has evolved, how political liberalism can be organized, and why people would reject liberal ideas. Now we're going to look at the difficulty of balancing the protection of individual rights and the need for security in a variety of liberal nations. Often, liberal societies will become illiberal in the pursuit of protecting society. So what does illiberal mean? It's not merely going against liberalism, like we would see in a dictatorship or a communist economy. That would be anti-liberal or non-liberal. Illiberalism occurs when a liberal society goes against liberal values but still claims to be liberal. An example of illiberalism would be racial profiling. While it's no longer legal, many police departments and other security organizations will use statistics to help them prevent crime by following certain ethnic groups. Have you ever heard the term driving while black? This term comes from the fact that police in many large U.S. cities are more likely to pull over a car being driven by a black person because of the assumption that a black person is more likely to commit a crime. This, of course, goes against the liberal values of innocent until proven guilty, of treating each individual equally regardless of ethnicity. But police departments argue that they only have so many resources, so they need to anticipate how those resources can best be used. We also see this in the reaction to the various terrorist attacks in the 21st century. No-fly lists in Canada and the United States are filled with the names of Muslim people who have to fight to prove their innocence. The case of Mara Arar is a great example of someone having to do this. There have been too many instances of innocent Muslims being arrested for the suspicion of terrorist activities, like taking pictures of the CN Tower and sending them to family in Afghanistan because they must be scoping out potential terrorist targets. If a Caucasian Canadian took those pictures and sent them to family in Europe, would they be flagged as potential terrorists? What about reasonable accommodation? This is the idea that we should be assisting minorities to fit into mainstream society. The controversy comes when common norms or expectations are changed. This became a huge debate several years ago when a Sikh Canadian wanted to join the RCMP but was told he had to remove his turban to wear the Stetson hat. He argued that reasonable accommodation would allow him to change the uniform in order to protect his religious beliefs. The courts agreed that he could in fact wear his turban as long as it was the same color as the Stetson hat. Yet in another example, a woman fought to be allowed to wear a burqa in a courtroom. The judge determined that the defendant had the right to see the face of someone testifying against him. Therefore, this woman was unable to testify because she was unwilling to uncover her face in public. There are many other issues relating to reasonable accommodation, not only in Canada, but internationally. Many of these issues that have made the news in the last few years include wearing the kirpan, allowing the hijab in public schools, or building mosques with minarets in some Christian communities. These are great areas to research and make your own decision regarding the accommodation of Eastern culture in Western liberal nations. Censorship also puts a strain on liberal societies. One of the key aspects of liberalism is freedom of speech, but can we limit your right to say what you want and still claim to be liberal? For example, we don't allow pornography to be sold to children. We've banned the Westboro Baptist Church from coming into Canada because of the message they send against gay rights. Christian displays in public buildings have been banned in many areas. We don't allow the use of some words on primetime TV. Many books have been banned from schools because of the use of offensive language. There are warning labels on media like music CDs, movies, and video games. Should a book that tells people how to be a terrorist be allowed to be published? Many of these forms of censorship have been accepted in our society because they allow the government to prevent harm to other groups, like a minority student having to read a book in class that's filled with racial slurs against her ethnicity. Another issue is the idea of hate crimes. In many liberal societies, the idea of violence against members of a minority group merely for being different is heinous. So we have created laws that state if you commit a crime because of hatred against a minority group, be they Jewish, gay, or Muslim, you will receive a more serious punishment. The intent is to eradicate discrimination. But here's the question. Is it right to punish someone for the intent of their crime? If somebody vandalizes a building, should there be a more serious punishment because it was a mosque or a synagogue? That would mean we're punishing people for their thoughts more than their action. Well, let's take a look at Canada's history. You're probably already familiar with the terrible conditions that existed in many residential schools. These acts to impose liberalism were justified in the minds of many Canadians at the time, as the goal was to make the Indian problem go away, as we would assimilate the First Nations children into the mainstream, white culture. Of course, Canadians today recognize this as very illiberal, and we've since apologized for this scar on our past. Historically, our immigration laws were also very illiberal, with a Chinese head tax put into place to try and prevent further Chinese immigration once we were done with the Chinese labor in building the railways. Our immigration offices were often directed to attract immigrants from favorable nations, read Caucasian. During World War I, legislation was passed to deal with crisis situations, and of course war is a serious crisis. The War Measures Act gave the executive branch the power to use martial law, suspend habeas corpus, enact conscription, control the economy, and work without the need to go through the legislative branch to pass laws. This is a serious move as it essentially cancels the fundamental processes of democracy, but it's argued that this is necessary. We don't have the time to debate. The issues must be dealt with quickly. Canadians may lose some of their freedoms, like freedom of the press, or be mandated to ration goods, because it's in the best interest of all Canadians. This law was used 3 times in Canadian history: World War I, World War II, and during the FLQ crisis. During the World Wars, we had internment camps where we took enemy aliens and put them into locations where we could prevent them from rising up against us. Some of these prisoners had their property seized and were used as slave laborers. Families could be separated and living conditions were substandard. During the FLQ crisis, the government suspended freedom of the press to prevent the publication of the FLQ manifesto and did sweeping arrests and searches without going through the usual legal channels. But in these cases, aren't we assuming that the enemy aliens are not loyal Canadians? Were the widespread arrests of FLQ members politically motivated? Isn't this guilty until proven innocent? And how does all of this relate to illiberalism? And were they justified actions? Today, we've replaced the War Measures Act with the Emergencies Act and the Anti-Terrorism Act. One reason for this change is to minimize the level of power given to the executive branch. Remember, the Nazis enacted the Enabling Act, which is much like the War Measures Act, and that turned Germany into a dictatorship. These new laws still give the executive branch special powers, but those powers are limited not only in scope, but also in the length of time that those powers are in force. The United States also has emergency legislation. After the 9/11 terrorist attacks, many Americans were willing to give up their liberal rights in exchange for greater security. Legislation passed quickly through the House and Senate to give the executive branch increased abilities to wiretap, investigate potential terrorists, increase spending for agencies like the CIA, and of course, wage war to prevent terrorism. This law is known as the USA Patriot Act, or Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act of 2001. As the war on terror was waged, decisions needed to be made on what to do with the prisoners being captured. The United States needed information from these captives to prevent terrorism, so they built Guantanamo Bay, a prison in Cuba that is on U.S. soil. That was given to them when the U.S. helped Cuba gain their independence from Spain. So why build a prison in Cuba? Well, because the U.S. could then claim that the rights that protect prisoners in the U.S. wouldn't apply because, well, it's not officially in the U.S. In addition, these captives were not called prisoners, as there are international laws to protect prisoners of war. Instead, these captives were labeled detainees. Lawyers sat down and advised the government on what could be labeled as torture and what wasn't. So things like waterboarding were labeled as enhanced interrogation techniques to gain vital information. Some prisoners were also sent to secret prisons for rendition. All of this impacts the reputation of liberalism and helps those dictators who reject liberalism gain support for their opposition. Why do you want to be liberal when liberal nations are so hypocritical? The case of Omar Khadr is a great research topic to highlight many of the issues relating to Guantanamo Bay. Many other examples illustrate the ideas of illiberalism, including the apartheid policies of South Africa when the government justified the institutionalized racism against Native Africans in the guise of greater security. This decades-long policy was only lifted when there was enough international pressure to demand that the South African government respect the rights of all citizens. It can be easy to look at other countries or our past and point out to the ways that they were or are illiberal. But the reality is that in liberal societies, we can't allow absolute freedom. Even very strong liberals agree that your freedoms end when it conflicts with the rights of others. So when the government brings in a curfew because youth vandalism is damaging public property, can't somebody argue that the rights of the young people have to be limited because they're infringing on the rights of the community? Or couldn't someone argue that no-fly lists are there to keep the terrorists off our planes and keep us safe? That censorship prevents people from being offended or feeling unsafe, that the creation of supercomputers to scan the internet and spy on people's private online communication is just out there to find potential threats. When is it okay to be illiberal?